Sometimes, as a potter, you become completely obsessed with a specific shape. In this instance, it's a bowl, and it's a form you'll have seen a lot on my Instagram lately, and here on YouTube too. And this week I'm going to be throwing, trimming, glazing, and finally reduction firing a scaled up version of one of these. There are times when a specific shape will creep into your mind, and you sort of just have to keep on making numerous iterations of the same vessel until you get it out of your system. I've had a few of these bowls fire really successfully, but I haven't made any larger versions yet, only medium-sized vessels and some much smaller pieces too. For a long time I've been trying to elevate the bowl shapes I make. Not height-wise, which yes, these do have tall feet, so they are elevated in some way, but in terms of taking a vessel that is mostly functional and pushing it to a point where it could be considered more sculptural. Think of the bowls made by Lucy Ree. It's obvious they're bowls, but they aren't shapes that you would typically think of using. Instead, she's managed to take them to a point where they almost feel like pieces of art. Back when I was making bowls that were entirely curved, due to the minimal nature of my work, it's quite difficult to elevate a shape like that, because as the curved form is scaled up, it still just remains a simple curved shape, and it lacks a touch of individuality, especially with the glazes I use that tend to coat pots in a single layer of colour. These are still curved forms initially, they're thrown like that, with thicker walls and a large expanse of clay in the base. This way, once the clay has turned leather hard, I can trim the outside shape to be more angular, whilst maintaining the curved shape on the inside, thus keeping the best from both worlds. And the two bowls you'll see me create in this video are my first attempt at scaling it up, which means I'm pretty sure they won't be exactly right, but this will be my first attempt of many. I'm mixing a batch of soft reclaim with a bag of fresh clay to make these, which is a touch on the firm side, hence why I'm softening it down. To do this, I simply cut thin slices of each, and then I layer them together in a block like so. And then I'll cut wedge this entire mass, and from this point the lump is sliced in half and one piece of it is slammed on top of the other. This effectively doubles the number of layers in the block each time this process is repeated, and considering I started with a mass of clay that had about 12 layers, after cut wedging the block 20 times there'll be approximately 12.5 million layers, which is more than enough to completely blend the two bodies, together with popping any small air pockets inside. Then, for good measure, I wedge the lump some more, to work it into a better shape for throwing with on the wheel. I also make sure there are no overly distinct folds in the bottom, as if there's a crevice in this section when you throw it against the wheel head, it can trap air underneath it as it's thrown down, which can either make centering slightly tricky, or, when it comes to trimming the piece, when I turn the bowl upside down, there could be a hollow in the foot, which I'd then either have to plug up or trim around, so it's simply better to deal with it at this point, so that can never even happen. The next thing I do is seal the lump of clay around the bottom, and I pat it mostly into shape. When you are working with larger lumps of clay, dry centering can be very helpful, as it can make the initial few cones up and down just that bit easier. When I'm centering larger masses of clay like this, I try to cone the entire lump up and then I press it down into a thicker round disc of clay. In this case, I'd say the stoneware I was using was a touch on the firm side, a quality that can make centering larger amounts of clay a real bore. And in some ways I think it's easier to start off with soft clay, simply to make the centering process more straightforward. Then, later on, say if you are making a slightly more complex shape, such as an angular vase or a bowl with walls that really overhang, then at a certain point you can use a gas torch or a heat gun to slightly dry the clay out and strengthen it. This way the centering itself isn't so arduous, and thereafter the shaping can be done with confidence too. Once the lump of clay has been centered, I open it up by pressing my digits firmly into the center. As I do this, I also clasp my hand around the outside to keep the spinning walls under control and centered. And the good thing about this specific shape I'm making is that I can leave plenty of clay in the foot itself, which means I don't have to press down nearly so far, and all that clay being there will help the pot hold its shape. As this outer ring of clay is so thick, the first thing I do is just collar it up slightly to thin the walls out and to make the subsequent pulling of them easier. And there is at this point an undulation in the rim, but after compressing this back down, I hope it won't be too much of an issue. When I'm pulling the walls up like this, I'm letting the clay collide with the palm of my hand, which is angled to direct the clay upwards as the two collide, and my fingers on the outside are just lightly pressing out to make sure the clay is consistently hitting that hand on the outside. After doing this a couple of times, it thins the walls out and makes them much easier to throw in a more conventional way. I press in with a soaked sponge towards the bottom, creating an indentation. It's then this indentation which I lift up, with my fingers on the inside pressing out where that bulge is, and it really is a very slow procedure. The key being that you want to move very gradually and consistently, as if you linger in one spot for too long, you can create a thin spot. Equally, if you move too quickly and your wheel speed doesn't match, you'll make throwing rings that are too prominent, that will actually lead to the vessel becoming rather weak and actually difficult to get any more height out of. From this point, I'll begin angling the walls outward, and I've purposefully left the rim to be relatively thick so that I can throw the angular section into it, as at this stage, if you've made the rim really thin and weak, it can be practically impossible to widen the form anymore without the lip splitting or a rather severe undulation appearing. As I speak and narrate this video, it's actually been a month or two since I threw these, and during that time I've thrown this specific shape a ton more, and there are actually a few things I would do differently as compared to what you're seeing in the video here. The first point being that I would have actually left the rim thicker, and I would have already created that indentation towards the top, or at least I would have set it roughly within the rim, as even after this indented part is stretched out, it still remains somewhat present, and it makes shaping it after the rim has been taken to its widest point not quite so difficult. Secondly, considering the trimming this piece will undergo, I would have left the top third of this part slightly thicker, as due to its thickness at this stage I couldn't quite alter it to the exact shape I wanted. Nonetheless, to create the indentation, I simply wet the top and then press an index finger into the rim from the outside, while supporting it from the inside with my left hand. The rim itself is then thrown to a sharper beveled edge that flares outward. The next thing I would have done is scrape off the slip lightly, and then I would have blasted it with a heat gun to dry this surface out, as by doing that I could have been a bit more confident in my shaping hereafter, and I think I may have also been able to correct the slight undulation this pot has, although I am able to deal with the worst of that at the leather hard stage, after the bowl has dried out a touch. For the rim, I use a sharp metal kidney to scrape away the slip and to create a more defined shape. And generally when I do this, especially for the rim of a pot, I'm pressing the clay out against the metal rib instead of digging the metal into the clay, as doing that will be a surefire way for the metal to snag, ripping and dragging the entire rim off centre and potentially distorting it or even tearing it. I then chamois leather the rim smooth, and that's the upper portion of this vessel complete for now. The next step is to remove much of the slip from the inside and to tidy up the internal shape. I use a sponge initially to soak up any excess material and to smooth the walls over, and then I switch to using a metal kidney to scrape over the walls and to create a more flush surface, although again this has to be done with care, as by pressing too firmly on the interior surface you can end up distorting the exterior shape and easily create an undulation or distortion in the entire piece. Thus, if there is any major refinement I have to do, I'll simply wait and do it at the leather hard stage when there's no risk of altering the shape. I then scrape away the scruffy skirt of clay from around the bottom, and then in order to get this thing off the wheel, as I didn't throw it on a bat, my fault, I'll dry out the exterior surface a touch, especially the foot, so that I'm able to lift it away without the bowl changing shape too much. I plan on trimming the foot of this a lot, so in order to pry this off I can just stuff my fingers into the stoneware and carry it away, like so. Even though doing this created some indentations in the foot, I'm going to be trimming past those anyway, so it really isn't an issue. I made 3 of these in total, one of which will meet its demise at the trimming stage. The other 2 are cooling in the kiln as I speak, which means depending on how that goes, these may or may not be successful. The following morning, the pieces were almost entirely dry, but the undersides just needed a touch more, so I placed the bowls on bats on banding wheels so I could spin them around easily, and I set the fan on the lowest setting for about half an hour or so. And with that, the trimming can commence. There is some movement in the rim, so I'm going to try my best to fix that. I start by flipping the bowl upside down. It's tap-centered. And then I'll trim this section to be completely flat. This causes the vessel to sit flat most of the time, and nullifies any slight undulation in the rim, but sometimes even doing this isn't enough. In an ideal situation, I would have dried these pots really slowly to leather hard, and when I next make some, that's precisely what I'm going to do. The walls will be left on the slightly thicker side, they'll be thrown more evenly, and then I'll dry them really slowly and evenly. The more I make larger pots, the more I've realised how important this is. The vertical undulation has been dealt with, but what's left is the fact that the rim itself is slightly oval, and this is something I should be able to fix the worst of. First though, I attach the bowl back onto the metal, which I do by brushing some slip onto the wheel head and then placing the bowl on top of this. Then, as the bowl is tap-centered, the friction that's created in the movement causes that slip to meld with the clay of the bowl and the wheel head, fusing the vessel in place. I then pressed a plastic kidney out against the rim to try and make it circular again. The next step is to just clean over the inside, as the internal walls weren't left to my liking. The rim section was then trimmed, and it's through doing this that I should really be able to fix its shape. The flared part is trimmed both on the inside and outside, and one reason I wish I left this part thicker is so that I could have trimmed the point where these two angles meet, the indentation itself, more, in order to create a slightly more defined shape. Following on from this, I'll begin to trim the straight planes in the curved section of the wall, and it's at this point that I can purposefully trim away the undulation that does exist, which I do by turning away more from one side than the other. This can of course lead to some issues if the vessel is made too thin, but I think in this instance there's going to be enough clay in the pot as a whole to account for it. Also, looking back, I should have turned the foot of this to be slightly more narrow, perhaps a touch taller too, but the only way I could have really changed that is by throwing the pot with even more clay left in the base. Either way, these are more notes added for when I next have a go at these. What I like about trimming pots this way up, initially, is that I can really feel the cross-section of the wall, as obviously as I can reach my hand inside the vessel, I can feel it. This means I can be really accurate with my trimming, and when it is eventually flipped upside down, I can keep that knowledge in my mind's eye so I know how much to turn away and where from. This is my heaven, by the way. Trimming pots, refining their shape, and creating forms that would simply be very difficult to make at the throne stage. Over the past couple of years, I felt like my pieces have become more architectural. They're often built up of lines, ledges, and angles, and I can't tell you how exciting it feels to be able to extend this into the range of bowls I create. And in this coming September, I'll be exhibiting a collection of these, displayed in hopefully a rather interesting way in one of my favourite museums in London. But more on that soon. And the other thing that's happening at around the same time, in October, is the publication of the paperback of my book, By My Hands, A Potter's Apprenticeship, which has an entirely new cover, which I'd love to hear your thoughts on. And you can, by the way, already purchase the hardback version of this, with no delay at all, link to which I'll leave in this video's description. Back to the bowl at hand, and the next step is to hollow away all that excess clay from inside the foot. This is a really satisfying process, although it is a tricky one that requires a lot of control if you want to remove large swaths of clay like so. I start in the centre and carefully work the blade outward, making sure I don't get too close to the wall on the outside, as it's incredibly easy for the blade to catch and rip away too much material from there, ruining the foot beyond repair. Thus, once enough depth has been trimmed, I spend time carefully thinning this part and flattening the wall. But with a pot this size, I can't trim the foot to be too thin and weedy, otherwise I'm sure that it would distort during the firing. But I think looking back I should have trimmed it to be a touch thinner, and like I mentioned before, the overall width of the foot should have been narrower. It's the very bottoms of my pots which are always cleaned up the most, as once glazed it'll be this part that remains bare, so I burnish this area smooth, which I do with a plastic kidney to compress the surface. And it's then this portion of the bowl which I can stamp with my maker's mark. And that's one of 3 bowls finished, for now at least, as the next part of the process is a relatively boring one, and that's drying these out to bone dry, which I'm going to do carefully beneath plastic so that it dries evenly. You need to be careful, as if I left this out in the open and it dried more from one side than the other, then that could cause the bowl to lean or warp in that direction, creating a lopsided piece in the long run. Here's a before and after, roughly. The second one was easy to trim too, and there was less movement in its walls overall too, although with a smaller version next to it, it made that disparity in the size of the foot a bit more obvious, although I think the second one did have a slightly better shape. And then there was the third piece, which had a good shape initially, although I think it dried out too much on one side, as I could feel that the clay was harder to trim on one side of this as it rotated. This meant that the pot was uneven, and in my attempt to correct this, I trimmed it too thin. But this does at least mean that we get to see a nice cross-section of the piece. Which demonstrates just how much material is left in the bottoms of these. But you can also clearly see how I turned away more material from one side than the other in my attempt to fix the undulation. It's a shame, yes, but undergoing problems like this is completely necessary when making pottery, and it's precisely how you learn. After all the moisture had left these pots, they can be packed into my electric kiln for a bisque firing to 1000 degrees Celsius. I didn't manage to fit them both into the same kiln load, so I fired one after the other. This firing changes fragile, soft clay into much harder and stronger ceramic. Although stoneware fired to 1000 degrees Celsius is still relatively weak, I could easily snap these pots if I grip them firmly enough or try to tear a handle off a mug, meaning that they still need to be handled with care and with dry, clean hands, as if you get grubby, oily fingerprints all over the pots. That can potentially cause less glaze to adhere onto those areas, as essentially the ceramic at this stage is full of tiny holes that absorb water. Thus, if they become partly blocked at this stage, then the glaze won't fire properly onto these parts. Glaze itself is a mixture of water and a whole heap of different raw materials. When pots are dipped into glaze, the absorbent body takes in the water, but the raw materials particles are too large to enter the clay body, so instead they cling to the surface of the pot, creating a layer of glaze. If the pots are submerged for too long, then the piece becomes fully saturated and the glaze might not dry properly. Equally, you can apply too thin a layer of glaze and it won't give you the desired effect. There's a lot of trial and error in glazing, and it's often, I think, a very overlooked part of the process. Now, I actually don't want any glaze to adhere to the foot of this, so to prevent the glaze from sticking to the body, I simply brush some wax emulsion over the foot. This creates a simple wax resist the water won't be able to permeate, thus the raw materials suspended within won't stick to it, and thankfully it just burns away in the second firing without leaving a trace. And as always, I dab some extra over the maker's mark to properly seal it. This bowl is a tricky shape to glaze. The bucket really isn't big enough to dip it all in one go, so the first thing I'm going to do is pour glaze into the foot. And I'll swirl it around in here, so the inside of the foot is covered evenly. I'll then fling that back into the bucket, which I've got to do quite quickly as I don't want any more of the glaze coating the exterior surface. And then I dip the exterior form, like so, right up to the rim. The foot itself traps a bubble of air within it as I press it underneath, which is why I coated the inside of the foot first, as it leaves me with a much neater layer of glaze. Without the indentation towards the top, lifting the bowl out of the glaze would be really difficult, but I can just press my fingers into the groove and lift. I then place the bowl on the tabletop and twist it a couple of times to remove any glaze from the foot. This won't tidy the foot perfectly, but it does get rid of much of the glaze that ends up clinging onto the wax. It's now the following day and the exterior glaze has dried out, which means I can now coat the inside. I pour a few jugs worth of glaze inside the bowl, and then I'm going to swirl it around and very carefully let it pour over the lip and back into the bucket of glaze. I know you normally do this the other way around, first the inside of a pot and then the outside, but say I had done that, and I had just dipped the exterior form of the bowl into the glaze, then lifting it out would be really difficult, as it dries into a rather powdery soft layer, and I wouldn't easily be able to gain purchase on that ledge on the inside without damaging it, such as accidentally chipping the glaze or rubbing it and creating a thin patch. Whilst this technique isn't perfect, as some glaze does peel over, I'll be able to tidy up the rim with relative ease once this new layer of glaze is dried out. You can see that it turns a much paler colour once dry. There's quite a bit of tidying up to do. I generally start on the inside, rubbing over any small inconsistencies I can find. I then move up to the rim, fettling back any stray drips to create as flush a surface as I can. I then use a sharp metal kidney to scrape over the rim, removing any high points to create a really uniform finish around the top. It's perhaps easier to make a mistake at this stage as compared to any other step thus far. If I use the tool too abruptly to remove any of the glaze, it can tear away a much larger chunk than intended, which then means I have to patch it up, let it dry out, and then scrape over it again, like so. I work the drips back gradually, as again if you try and remove too much in one go, they tend to flake off, ripping away some of what's underneath it too, so I scrape it back layer by layer until it's flush with the rest of the glaze that surrounds it. I should mention that before I began tidying up this bowl, I cleaned my workbench. This way, all the glaze that is eventually removed, I'll be able to scrape the glaze into a basin I keep specifically for glaze waste for this specific colour, as it means in the long term I can sieve this back into the larger bucket of glaze, which means that nothing that's taken off is actually wasted. Once the protruding part has been more or less scraped back, I switch to my fingertip, which I use like sandpaper, almost, which I lightly brush over the surface, again, my aim being to create as even and smooth a layer all the way around. Now, in order to tidy up the bottom, I basically construct a tower of sorts that's topped with a pad of foam, and I'll place the bowl upside down onto this. As it's quite a large object, holding this pot with one hand whilst tidying it up with the other will get tiring very quickly. So this solution works well, and it means the rim isn't resting against anything, as that's the most vulnerable point on these, the part that's most likely to chip. And when tidying up the underside of this piece, I'm again doing the exact same thing that I was doing to the inside and the rim. And if I feel like the glaze is especially thick around the foot, as this was the part that was submerged for the longest, I just scrape it back by about 1 millimeter or so, as there is a chance if the foot is glazed too heavily that it flows over the foot and welds the piece to the kiln shelf it's being fired on. The final part to clean up is the actual foot itself, and if you remember those facets I trimmed on the foot, these act almost like a guide which makes tidying up the foot here with the knife easier, as I can simply glide the blade along following these lines. I then do the same for the inside, working quickly and confidently to create a clean finish. The very last thing I do is run a damp sponge around the foot. This removes any tiny speck of glaze that may be present and creates a crisp line where glaze and clay meet on either side of the foot. I should mention, if you're watching this and you've been glazing pots and you want to tidy them up, not every glaze in the pottery world can be worked in the same way. In fact, you may tidy your glazes up like this, only to find that the tongue marks are still present, and where you got the glaze saturated with water, it's changed colour and texture slightly. All of this is to say that how you clean your glazes up can really depend on the type of glaze you're using, the clay body, and how it's fired, which means this way of doing it may not necessarily work for you. And the real key to success is just trial and error, to find out which specific methods work for you. With the bowl at long last cleaned up, I can move on to packing and firing my Rohde KG340 gas kiln. Here's all the waste glaze that came off that piece, which I'm scraping into a basin of water just off screen. I'll be firing both of these bowls side by side in the kiln, with every single pot inside this kiln load being carefully placed so that absolutely nothing touches. Otherwise the glaze that coats them will fuse together and they'll have to be torn apart afterwards, a process that normally destroys both pieces. I decided to place a bit of shelf underneath the bowl just to give everything on this layer a bit more space, and once I was happy with everything, I can place another kiln shelf on top and fill the rest of the void above. With the kiln fully packed, I spend the rest of the day finishing off odd jobs and tidying up the workshop, and then tomorrow I'll come in really early and light the kiln at 7 AM on the dot. The gas is turned on, and then each of the 4 burners in each corner of the kiln are ignited. They're all set on the lowest possible setting, and I do all of this with the door open. This way gas doesn't accumulate inside the chamber, which is then suddenly lit, as this can lead to a small explosion. The door itself is then closed and sealed tight, and so begins the 9-hour-long reduction firing. I don't raise the temperature too rapidly, as by doing so you can cause the pots themselves to explode, as even though they're dry there is still moisture inside them, and if all of that suddenly turns to steam, then the pots can explode and shatter into hundreds of pieces. Every 30 minutes I log all the necessary data, and I follow previous firing logs to keep me on track, which for this beginning period is very straightforward, as all I'm really doing is just turning up the gas gradually every 30 minutes or so. The first bit of real excitement happens at 860 degrees Celsius. At this point I turn the gas pressure and the air pressure up significantly, and I close the flues that cover the back of the kiln about halfway. This causes too much gas to accumulate inside the chamber, and there simply isn't enough oxygen present for it to burn properly. As a result, the burning atmosphere ends up stripping away oxygen from the clay and glazes themselves, thus changing their colour and creating tones and textures that can be rather difficult to recreate with an electric kiln. Naturally, the rise in temperature slows down after reduction, so if I find the kiln is stalling a touch, I just tap open the dampers a bit more so less fuel accumulates inside and it can fire more efficiently. And when it's time to conclude the firing, I simply switch the gas off and then switch each of the 4 burners off and the air too. And that's more or less it. But the last thing I do is just open the dampers and take the bungs out of the spy holes in the door, and I let the kiln crash cool back down to 1000 degrees Celsius. This helps to retain colour and sheen and will prevent too much crystal growth from occurring. And now all that I have to do is wait for 2 days until the kiln has cooled down fully. And in a rare moment I'm actually recording this narration before seeing the finished bowls, which means I'm on tenterhooks just like you are. I fired on Wednesday and it's now Friday, and the kiln is at long last ready to unpack. I always start by opening the dampers and taking the bungs out of the spy holes, and I'll leave the kiln with the door ajar for about an hour or so, as it's still very hot inside, especially towards the top. And at first glances, the bowl looks really good. The glaze looks even, and it's pooled in all the right places, and it doesn't look like it's stuck onto the kiln shelf. There's a few surprises here, mainly from metal inclusions that were mixed into the clay the bowl was made from. This has resulted in some red dots and some grey specks, too, from bronze and silver, respectively. There is some slight movement in the rim, but not enough for it to be detrimental. The next step for this piece is to quickly sand the base. I know I already burnished it a lot at the leather hard stage, but as this stoneware shrinks, it does so around the coarse specks of sand, grog, the clay contains. Thus the surface becomes somewhat gritty again, so I polish it lightly with a diamond pad. And here's the second bowl, which I actually think I prefer. It's slightly taller and the glaze has coated it beautifully, and due to the tone of the green, those grey specks aren't present. But as always, I think the best way to show these off is in some photographs, as it can be really difficult to convey how an object properly appears in a video like this. Here's everything that fit inside the kiln, by the way. It was a really successful firing, with not a single second. I can't tell you the last time that happened. Anyhow, let's have a look at the pale green feldspathic bowl first. Here are those grey flashes. They're quite interesting, in a way. You can see the piece of metal in the very centre that causes it, but they're nowhere near as dramatic as the red dots that are caused by copper within the bronze. I sort of look at these as beauty spots that cover the pot, breaking up what would otherwise be a very uniform surface. And they sort of help to draw your eye across the shape. You follow them from dot to dot, and it makes you want to look closely at the object. There's then the dark green feldspathic crackle glazed bowl. It's a stunning piece, which I feel a bit guilty saying about my own work. But if you're a maker of pottery and one of the bigger pieces fires successfully, then you'll know just how wonderful it feels. For a relatively long time I've been concerned when glazing larger pieces, as there's just so much that can go wrong, and one tiny imperfection on the surface can ruin the entire piece. But I think all the gradual practice is finally paying off, as these are two of my favourite pots I've made in a long time. Despite the shapes not being 100% to my liking, as objects they have real presence, despite being so minimal and simple. Thanks so much for taking your time to watch. Let me know what you think of these pieces, and, as always, I'll see you next week.